Okay, let's get now to number 10. And this is actually, I think, probably my favorite one. And that is, who created God? I like this a lot. I mean, I can start on this one if you want.
Yeah, why don't you give me your thoughts first?
Yeah, so I like this one a lot because I think it really gets at the fundamental difference between the Christian or the theist and the non-theist. Because who created God, I think, is usually put in a context of like someone is giving an argument for the existence of God, and it's like, well, who created that God? And so if you need a response to who created the universe, then why don't you need the same for the God? But then the response from the theist is, oh, well, God is a special type of thing that doesn't need an explanation. And then the naturalist is going to co-opt that response and say, oh, well, then why don't we just say the same is true of the universe? The universe is the thing that doesn't need explanation. So we have these two competing views. God is the thing that doesn't need an explanation. And on the other side, it's the universe or, everything that isn't God that doesn't need an explanation. And that's really the fundamental difference between the two views. It's like, where do you draw the line? Like, where does the explanation stop? Does it stop at God? Does it stop at the universe? What's the best place to stop your explanatory line?
Yeah, that's very useful because, again, it depends on the context in which this is being said, right? So somebody might be using it as an argumentative tool. Somebody might say that we require the existence of a necessary thing. And then somebody might kind of casually ask, well, what explains that thing? It's like, what are you talking about? It's a necessary thing. You're not understanding the argument, but what they're actually trying to get at is they say, okay, but then what about the universe being necessary? Would that require an explanation? As if to kind of trip them up to say, well, if you're going to say that as long as you posit a necessary thing, you don't need further explanation, what if I posit that the universe is necessary? Now, of course, there'll be responses to this, that the universe is not infinite, it's past finite, this kind of thing. But it could be used as a kind of argumentative tool in that respect. It's also going to depend on the argument that's being used. Because if we talk about, for example, if you take a kind of classical argument for the existence of God, like an argument from motion or something like this, or even a contingency argument or anything involving a regress, the establishment of a first, unactualized actualizer, unmoved mover, uncaused cause is reached by the assumption that you cannot have an infinite regress of causation. So there must be something at the start. And if you ask, well, what caused that thing at the start? You're kind of misunderstanding what the argument is saying. You might just be disagreeing with it by asking that. You might say, well, that seems to still require a cause, and then you're positing like an infinite regress of causation. But if the argument is taking this form of like, infinite regresses cannot occur, therefore wherever you have a regress, there must be a first member. And then somebody asks, well, what comes before that first member? It's like, you're either just disagreeing with that premise, which is fine, or you've kind of not understood what we're doing here. It's similarly if somebody's talking about explanations, they say that everything requires an explanation, and they posit contingent things, and they say it must ultimately be explained by a necessary thing, and you say, well, what explains that necessary thing? It's like, I think you just kind of misunderstood what's being posited here. If you want to disagree with it and you want to say something like, well, something that explains its own existence can't exist, or something that doesn't have an explanation like a necessary being can't exist, that's fine. But to kind of accept that there is this necessary being at the beginning of the explanatory chain, and then to ask what explains it, well, have you understood what's meant by necessary being here? It's either meant by something that, by necessary being, people tend to either mean something that explains itself or something that just has no explanation. Like, maybe you've just misunderstood what's being posited here. Maybe you haven't misunderstood and you're just driving at this intuition that such a thing doesn't make sense. But all you're then doing is just denying that there is this first cause that you can ask of, like what caused it. So I think it's a little bit of a confused objection. I don't like it as a response. Of course, it can kind of lead to interesting discussions about what can be necessary, what kinds of things require explanations.
Where's the ultimate stopping point?
But if the argument is just that there must be a stopping point, if somebody accepts that argument and then says, well, what comes before that stopping point? Then they've misunderstood something. They haven't accepted that.
Maybe the question they should be asking instead is, why think that first thing is God or has divine attributes?
That's true. Yeah.
Maybe that's the question they should be asking instead.
Of course, I think somebody who asks it, again, depending on the context, right? But if you present somebody this kind of causal chain or something, and maybe they haven't heard the argument before or something, and the first kind of thought they have is like, okay, so we've got this explanatory chain that must terminate in like a necessary being. It's like, but what would explain that thing? I think, sure, you could technically say, you're being silly. What explains a necessary being? Well, it contains the existence as part of its own essence or something, so stop being silly. But again, let's be charitable here. What are they driving at? Maybe what they actually kind of mean, maybe that translates as something like, that can't be right. That seems like special pleading. It seems like you've got this infinite chain. It seems weird to just say that there's one point at which it just stops. I don't think that makes sense. I think that any point you choose, that would require an explanation, and so it would just keep going. And so when they say something like, what caused God? Maybe the thought they're driving at is something more like, I don't believe that there is a terminal cause at the back end of this regress. I think it goes on forever. Maybe that's like the thought that they're driving at. And they might kind of express it slightly unclearly by saying, what caused God? But maybe that's what they're driving at. And if that's what they're really driving at, that's what we should be engaging with. But if somebody actually says, no, I see what you're saying. Yes, we have this infinite regress of causes, and it must terminate in something. I agree. I understand. I'm with you. Now, what caused that thing? It's like you just haven't understood. You just don't know what the argument is saying.
Yeah. Okay.
It all depends on the context, right? With all of these claims,
yeah,
it's not the claim
and the way
itself,
that it's interpreted.
It's the way it's being put forward. Like with the Kalam thing. If you were to tell me, Cameron, that you think that the Kalam establishes the existence of God or the existence of the Christian God, I'd probably be like, okay, like let me hear you out. This sounds like an interesting argument. I want to hear what you're talking about. I wouldn't immediately just say, oh man, you're being so silly. Like the Kalam doesn't get you to God, because I know that you know enough to sort of realize that, and so you must have some interpretation of the Kalam that makes you think that it establishes God. Now that might still be wrong, but I wouldn't just say out of hand that this is a problem because the Kalam just doesn't establish God's existence. Maybe you have a good argument as to why it does. But if I was talking to somebody who'd never done any apologetics or philosophy, never considered any arguments before, had just heard the Kalam, came to me and said, I've heard about this argument called the Kalam cosmological argument, and it proves that God exists, I'd probably say to them that they have in fact jumped the gun. So it's difficult to offer an evaluation of a claim in isolation. The evaluation needs to be made based on who's making the claim, why they're making the claim, and crucially, not the claim per se, but what the thought that the claim is representing. What is somebody actually thinking? What is someone actually trying to express by saying these words? Most people in most conversations are imprecise. We're all imprecise. We use euphemisms. We say things that we don't quite mean. We're kind of trying to draw a picture for somebody of how we think. We can't quite put it into words. And so if we start taking this approach that if somebody says something like, the Kalam proves God, we go, that's kind of on my list of things that isn't true. No, that's wrong. And you get into an argument. Rather think, I wonder why they think that. I wonder, like, who are they? What reason might they have for thinking that? And that's what you should be judging. Not the claim, but the thought that the claim is seeking to express or that it represents.
Hello, Cameron here. Thanks for watching this little clip. If you want more, there's actually a whole interview this clip came from. Just click the link on the screen. Oh, and by the way, we post 2 to 3 new videos a week. So if you're interested in apologetics at all, make sure to subscribe to my channel so you can catch our latest content. And then lastly, remember that Christianity is true.